step-by-step food forest design for a tiny house. Last month we did an awesome installation and design for some local clients, Emma and Roland. They're incredible. They're building a tiny house here in the Bay of Plenty. They've given me permission to basically share the whole design process with you guys here. Hopefully it's helpful.
Today's the day when we start planning zone 1 of our food forest.
This is honestly the most exciting part. I'm more excited for this than the house. Like, screw the house. That's just somewhere to sleep at the end of the day. But today, we're planning food. Why are you looking at me like crazy?
Don't screw the house. The house is awesome.
Let's get it. In this video, I'm going to show you how I'm designing this food forest for a tiny house for some local clients. Now, if you don't know who I am, my name is Byron. I live in New Zealand, and I've been designing food forests for myself and clients for the past few years. And at this point, I'm just really excited to share a little bit more about the design process in hopes that if you're designing a food forest, it can help you out with whatever stage you're at. We've got some logs and branches laid out to identify where the pathways are going to go. Here are the planting areas. There's a contour to things. We're working on contour with the slope. Here's a diagram of what things ought to be looking like in the next couple of years. There's distinct areas where there's shelter, there's evergreen, subtropical areas, there's deciduous areas. So we'll kind of break into what each of those areas, why they're existing where they are, plant species, etc. Here's a top-down view just during planting, just identifiers for what particular kinds of species are located where and why. And then here's the final detailed design where we have specifics of each area, plant species. We'll dive into that and we'll get there, but just for a little starting context, we're in the Bay of Plenty. We're in USDA Zone 10A, which means we get around -1 to -2, depending on the particular area or the microclimate. We have about 2 meters of rainfall each year, and generally a wet winter, dry summer. This year was quite different. We had a really wet summer. So the context for this particular design is we're in the floodplains, and essentially what's been old grazing land for however many decades, they're now wanting to live there pretty much permanently. They've got their tiny house set up. If you look at this design, there's a lot of areas for future projects, whether that's large-scale agroforestry systems, animal integration, larger market gardens. But to start off with, we're really just focusing on this area right in here, just around the house, because as you can see in some of these older drone photos, the original ones where we took these a couple months ago, the bare soil that they brought in to create a level platform for their tiny house, it's bare soil, and you want that covered up as quickly as possible. You want it to not be eroding into the surrounding area, and they just want that vegetation because it feels really nice to live in an environment where there's lots of lush green vegetation, and if you can make it all edible, fantastic. So that's where we're starting. We're starting with this kind of what we're calling the Zone 1 food forest. If you're familiar with permaculture zoning, Zone 1 is pretty much the area immediately around the house. Zone 2 would be the areas tangent to that, requiring less and less daily interactions as you move further away from Zone 0, which would be your house. There's a few things that we're going to consider here in the site. Some of the things that we're going to look at first, though, are these basic contexts of the landscape. Solar aspect, that's hugely important. Where is north versus south? If you're in the northern or southern hemisphere, it's swapped. But basically, you want to be paying attention to where is your sun coming from. And so for this particular context, north is about there. Let me get a bit better. So that direction is north, which is really ideal because you can see their living space is oriented facing north, which is pretty much what you want, because in the winter when the sun is really low, you do want that solar aspect to be coming in, warming the house. It's just really ideal situation. If you can point the opening and the main living space of your house to the north, fantastic. It also creates a lot of really great opportunities for tree planting, which we'll see here shortly. So that's one of the first major influences to be thinking about. Another one in this particular context is wind. Wind is a huge one, especially when you're working with a bare landscape, somewhere that you're just moving a house onto, your house site is fresh. Wind can be a really big killer. If you're not careful, you're creating this beautiful outdoor space, but you don't have the shelter or you orient it in a funny way. Wind can just make an outdoor space unbearable. And so that's one of the biggest things. It can also make establishing other edible plants really tricky and difficult. So that's one of the big things to be thinking about first. The prevailing winds, the really cold winds, are coming from the south. So, and kind of from the southeast. So those are the main wind influences from that direction right there. And so already we're starting to build a picture in our minds of what kinds of species would want to go where, just based on those two first factors of where is north and where is the wind coming from. And basically what this is going to look like is we'll just keep on layering things, stacking them on top of each other until we kind of arrive at a design. That's my opinion, is that creativity, it takes a creative approach to things, but often you kind of arrive at a design rather than like coming up with a really creative and crafty solution. It's just you arrive at these designs based on the context. Access and water and slope. Those are some other things to be considering. So when we're looking at access, we'll zoom in here. The main access obviously is this driveway back here for the cars, and the car parking is behind to the south of the tiny house, the building, which is really ideal because you want to have people activities in the sunny side of a house, not on the shady side. And so if you can remove the social spaces from the cars, from the vehicles, and just give that degree of separation, really nice. And it also provides you these cool opportunities to create nice transitions. The main access from the daily commute of getting into your car, getting home from your car, you're coming in and around into the space like that. Now there's two social spaces that we've landed on here, and I'll put those in a different color, this kind of purple color. That's a social space, or it's planning to be, and then this deck right here is going to be another social space. So those are the two main areas where people are going to be hanging out outdoors. I'm a huge advocate of creating these nice, comfortable outdoor spaces to expand the living area, especially if you're in a tiny house. You want as much space as you can get. Switching back over to yellow for access ways, there's a few different access paths and opportunities that they're going to want. That main one, around into the front, there's another one that wants to come right down the ridge, because this is a slope, it's on contour, and so this first access is really just to like bring you into the main part of the landscape. As things develop more into the landscape, you're going to set up bigger annual vegetable gardens, crop gardens, you're going to have more fruit trees planted out. You just want that really obvious, wide, good access directly out there. You don't want to always have to be cutting around. Another access is down the back, down the south of the property, and then again right here off the deck to the north. So that already kind of subdivides our planting area into a few different sections. Considering our other elements, the wind, north-facing, access, social spaces, and what that wants, right? You don't want to sit, like we were talking about before, you don't want to sit in a social space where it's really cold and windy all the time. So one of the biggest things that's already given us an indicator of is where does our main evergreen shelter want to be, right? And it's clear that wants to be back here, right? To prevent, I'll just do this, I'll color that in for main evergreen shelter. It's going to want to protect that main social space, and it's going to want to start protecting all of our tree species as we begin planting out, right? We don't want to have things constantly subjected to the wind. It's going to make things a lot more difficult to establish, and it's just not going to result in the healthiest plants or the most comfortable growing environment or people environment. So southerly shelter is going to be a huge priority, and that's going to taper off this way. And as things expand, because obviously this is only focusing right here on this first initial zone, but their plans are to utilize this whole property and this whole section. So obviously over time these shelter areas are going to be expanding, but the immediate focus right now is at this smaller scale around zone 1. You might see there's a road that runs right along that way, and then it kind of curves this way. So privacy is a big one here because, you know, obviously the history of the land is just used to be grazing paddocks, so it didn't have any need for privacy. But now that there's a tiny house here, it kind of sticks out. The clients have already begun planting some evergreen privacy along the road. That's one thing to be mindful of, is where do you need shelter from the wind? Where do you need shelter from maybe neighbors, cars that are driving by? That's especially one right here, because when you're sitting on the deck, it's just you're sitting out like a sore thumb with onlookers from the road, especially because they're really curious. People are used to driving by and just seeing a paddock, and now they're seeing all this development of this tiny house and now these gardens and this deck. So giving yourself that sense of privacy, it just allows you to relax in your own home. So part of how we create privacy is fast-growing evergreen species. So that's one of the areas that we've kind of determined, as well as it's a little bit more sheltered there just because of the tiny house. It's a little bit more tucked in. So that's another area where we're going to be putting evergreen species. Now, we're not getting to the details yet. We're not getting to the details of what exact species and what exact layout. The main function at this point is high-level patterns. Shelter, access, privacy, solar aspect. A really fantastic design solution, deciduous trees on the north side of social spaces and houses. What that does is it creates shade in the summer to keep things cool, but in winter, when it's deciduous, the leaves have dropped, it still lets that sunlight, which comes down really low in the horizon, it lets that sunlight in, which is super important. So that's the main distinction, is that we've determined that there's a few different evergreen areas, and then there's a few different deciduous areas. Again, this isn't super detailed yet of plant the apple tree right next to this, right next to that, next to the citrus, but we do have an idea of what kinds of species would want to start going where. At this stage, we're just building really rough pattern layouts. So we'll jump over to a new photo where we can see some of the access paths that we've kind of determined. I'll put those in yellow again for our access, because that's going to be our access color. Our access that comes from the car parking area down, because they're planning on putting some kind of additional dwelling here, so it'll be nice to have a degree of privacy from that as well. Once you're kind of developing the space and you potentially might have visitors or family or guests on site, it'd be nice to just have that degree of separation so it doesn't feel like they're peering into your social space, which again, we'll put the social spaces in that lavender purple color. Just right here where we had stacked all the plants for the installation. Again, just marking out the access paths. One down the middle, this kind of major access, which is going to be probably one of the more frequently used ones, and then one that comes straight off with a staircase off the front of the deck right over here. Those are the three main access ways. And again, if we're looking at this southerly wind exposure, that's probably one of the biggest priorities. We're going to put some fast-growing evergreen species there that are going to be productive. They're also going to have other functions like providing biomass, but the immediate thing that we want is just that fast-growing evergreen shelter to protect us from the cold winds. What that might look like is selecting a few different species. All right, so maybe we have a slower-growing long-term tree that is still wind resistant, that still provides a good shelter. A really fantastic tree for that in this context is a feijoa. Feijoas are really tolerant of wind, poor conditions, they're evergreen, and they create fantastic hedges, especially if you plant them at a high density. That's one of the species that we opted for the long-term shelter. But because they're slow growing relative to how fast certain other support species or shelter species could grow, we're going to start combining them with a slightly faster growing species, which would be the banana. These are going to be special bananas, not actually going to be the edible bananas. We're going to choose what I call biomass bananas. I think that the actual variety is called the Samoan Giant, or the Giant Samoan. And essentially, they're wild bananas. They have seeds in them, but they're super tolerant of wind conditions. They're a lot hardier, and they're fantastic biomass producers. And so what we'll do is we'll combine those with the feijoas and whatever other species we end up putting here. That's going to grow a lot faster than the feijoas for shelter. It's also going to provide organic material as the shelter develops, as the bananas establish. It'll provide a fantastic source of ongoing, not only organic material, but also propagation material, because like I said before, they're going to want to keep expanding their shelter. And so what better way to do that is to get an initial nursery stock of bananas that you can begin replicating, multiplying, propagating, and expanding outwards. So that's going to be kind of their nursery stock of biomass bananas to continue establishing shelter. It's going to provide that initial immediate shelter in the first 12, 16 months. And over time, that area might transition away from biomass bananas into just the feijoas, and that's okay. That's part of the plant succession plan. There's still faster growing species that we can choose for this windbreak, because at this stage we have the bananas, we have the feijoas, but we could still go even faster with the shelter, biomass, and then again, if you can lean more into the nursery stock of choosing specific plants that you know you're going to need more of down the track, that's a fantastic option. This is going to be our Mexican sunflower. Our next layer of succession for that shelter will be Mexican sunflower. Immediate evergreen cover to reduce the wind, help those other species establish and begin producing that organic material and propagation material. Beyond that, we might put one more layer of shelter just because the wind can get atrocious. And like I said, they're just at the very beginning stages. They're wanting to get that propagation material, get the nursery, get the shelter established. And so we're probably going to go one more layer and have a row of bonnet grass. Bonnet grass is a fantastic, fast-growing support species. Can be left to get really big and act as more of a windbreak, and so all the same benefits as the bananas, as the Mexican sunflower: organic material, propagation material, immediate shelter, and over time it can succession away towards just feijoas or towards just the bananas and the feijoas, but just that initial shelter is really valuable. Quick interruption: if you're enjoying this video, make sure you leave a like. If you have any questions, leave a comment. It really helps me out just to know what you guys are most interested in and what can provide you with the most value. So hope you're enjoying. Back to the video. Now we've got a 4-tiered shelter that's going to begin creating that sun trap. A sun trap is basically a U-shaped shelter. The height tapers down as you point north, and it just really opens you up to capturing as much of that solar energy as possible, reducing the wind so you're not getting lots of heat loss. It just creates a really comfortable growing or living environment to have the good shelter but lots of northerly sun exposure. That's our backdrop. That's our shelter for the south. The feijoas, biomass bananas, Mexican sunflower, and bonnegrass. Those are all evergreen species, so we're fitting in that pattern of what we looked at before with just evergreens on the south. And then it's just going to be that northern edge, just in the middle, that northern ridge and that northern bit where it's those temperate species. Because like I said before, if you have those temperate species facing north, they'll lose their leaves in the winter when the sun is really low, and they'll allow you to get that solar gain. But in the summer, they're going to provide a lot of shelter. They're going to provide that really nice cooling effect. Another thing to be considering at this stage before we dive into the details of species selection is the access, because you want to work as close to contour as possible in most cases, unless you're trying to really direct water to the ridges or a certain direction. On contour work is just ideal if you're on a slope, and that's going to allow you to retain as much nutrient, water, organic material as possible, and also just have easy access. It's easier to walk level on contour than it is to walk zigzag up and down. So that's the major thing that's determining how we're organizing our planting layouts here. So looking at our secondary access paths, the ones that are going around the slope, they're still going to be on contour. And what you'll notice is that allows good access to all the different areas, which is what you're wanting. You don't want to have big gaps in areas that you can't easily access. Already, we've just determined that we've got our southerly shelter, we've got area for more evergreen species that kind of transitions into more deciduous species towards the front. And that's not to say that we can't include evergreen species on that front side, but they're probably not going to want to be at a really high density. They're probably not going to want to be massive trees or trees that end up getting massive, things that would stay a bit smaller, maybe like a lemon or a mandarin. And then we move around to this corner side where they're catching a lot of rainwater, but the tanks aren't going to hold infinite amounts of rainwater, and so the overflow is going to go back into this evergreen system over here. And so that's going to be really water-loving, evergreen, subtropical species, which again is also going to contribute to helping just develop more of that privacy around the social space of the road. People aren't going to see you from the road. I'll just skip over to how that design is kind of unfolded. And here we have what we've just kind of seen. We have this back row of the Mexican sunflower, the feijoas, the biomass bananas at a really high density, along with whatever other support, whether it's bonnegrass, Mexican sunflower, etc. And we continue that evergreen planting further around the outside. And again, that's going to contribute to more shelter for the social space, more privacy, and for whenever that secondary dwelling or any people come stay. And then as we move towards the north, we start transitioning into temperate and more Mediterranean species, because on one thing to note is that this soil is quite free draining, and so it doesn't hold water super well, which is part of the point of using this syntropic agroforestry method, just pumping organic material that you can chop and drop back into the system. And we'll get to what that looks like on a technical layout level, but part of creating good water holding capability in your soil is just having organic material. And so that's a huge reason for having all the chop and drop and all the support species, is just adding organic material into the soil. But that being said, the northernmost exposed ridge is still going to be the driest. It's going to have the most exposure. And so what we're looking at for that area right here is we're looking at Mediterranean species, or species that can handle those kinds of conditions. Drought and wind tolerant species, things that are deciduous, things that aren't super fussy and need huge amounts of really rich, nice soil. Especially towards the top, it's going to be less fertile and it's going to have less nutrients than the bottom of the hill. Especially towards the top, we're going with really drought tolerant, hardy plants, things like rosemary, things like figs, pomegranates, oregano, sage, which works really well because those are the things that you want right around your kitchen in a lot of cases. So we're kind of mapping the different plant communities to the conditions and to how it fits into the context. So over here we've got our subtropical species, we've got our Mediterranean species towards this middle area, and the temperate species, and then the subtropicals on outside edge, protecting from the road privacy, making use of that excess rainwater that won't fit in the tank. And you can see we've also got some grapes. There's going to be some evergreen passion fruit climbing up the deck as well, up the canopy, to just create that really nice feeling like you're in this lush paradise. You're out on your deck and you have this edible forest around you, and that's kind of the goal. The goal for these clients is really to have a beautiful but also productive outdoor living space that not only provides them with the nice feelings of living in a jungle, but also the food and the privacy and the shelter and all these things that contribute to having a high quality life, engaging with your landscape. That's what we're doing here, is we're creating these beautiful, it's not even just a food forest, it's kind of like a living ecosystem that supports people. So that's very exciting. If you look at the access ways, the access paths in between here, you can still see, I'll draw the access paths. On the edges of those paths is where you have your chop and drop species, herbaceous chop and drop things, rather than incorporating them into the tree line. Now I'll show you what that looks like on another example right here. Our main access path coming from the deck down the middle is there, and then our pathways. On each edge of these pathways, you'll see there's a teal line. That's going to be where our support species go, our chop and drop herbaceous biomass. Again, whether it's comfrey, whether it's bonnegrass, whether it's Mexican sunflower, that level of detail kind of depends on the exact context, the exact width, the exact conditions, the site conditions, and what you're looking for. But the pattern is that both sides of each tree line, of each tree bed, are going to have some kind of herbaceous chop and drop material for shelter, creating that organic material, and building that soil. And so the same applies here. That was a subtropical area where we have the evergreen species, and here where we have the more Mediterranean and temperate, we're going to have that same exact thing. And then the access that's going to come down for the staircase continues out this way. So that's the idea, is each of these access paths are lined with some kind of chop and drop, whether it's comfrey, bonnegrass, Mexican sunflower, or depending on your climate, you can have all sorts of things, but those are just the ones that we're looking at for this particular context. Now that we've kind of laid out the different planting layouts in terms of support species and trees, because all of our trees are going to go in the tree line, herbaceous supports are going to go on those edges. Sometimes the shapes are really funny and they don't fit exactly, and that's totally fine if they don't exactly fit into a midline. If it works, great, but if it doesn't, we can still just kind of spot plant things, especially at a small scale. Like if you're doing things at a really big scale, you probably don't want to have haphazard planting one thing here and something over there and just kind of a funny, not super organized way, because it makes ongoing management really difficult. But if you're just talking about a really small area, especially if it's up here just around the deck, and it's not going to be a huge deal if you have to kind of like shuffle things around a little bit, if you're going to have to be really extra careful when you're placing organic material, you're doing your chop and drop, versus if you're doing things at a 2 acre or 3 or 10 acres, you really need to be all about efficiency. And so as you get closer to the deck and as you get closer to living spaces in zone 1 and smaller scale, you can just have things kind of planted in these less organized guilds. But as soon as you start scaling up and making bigger systems, that's where you kind of want things to be a little bit more strict and tidy. Here's the actual map of all the different areas and the exact species combinations. So we'll take a look and see what those include. We'll zoom in first for the sun trap shelter. You can see some of the characteristics. Fast growing, you need them to be wind tolerant, evergreen species. A bonus is biomass production and nursery stock. Feijoas, multiple varieties, biomass bananas, Mexican sunflower, and the bonnegrass. All things we've already talked about. Next, we'll look at the support lines, which are this teal color that's kind of throughout the entire plan. Dense rows of chop and drop species. They're on contour whenever possible to prevent erosion, slow the water, and slow the nutrient loss. Like I said before, the species selection is going to vary depending on what area and what the context is. And those species are predominantly going to be bonnegrass, comfrey, Mexican sunflower, but there's some other options as well. There's yacon, there's Jerusalem artichokes, there's canna lilies, there's all sorts of options. These are just 3 that work really reliably for massive amounts of organic material production and shelter. So next we'll look at the kind of the evergreen subtropical / Mediterranean area to the east of those social spaces to, again, help establish quick shelter, that sun trap, build a more effective windbreak and screen. Some of the species that we're including in here are bananas, tamarillos, cherimoya, bay trees, pomegranates, figs, mulberries, inga beans, sugarcane, cherry guava, Chilean guava, an avocado that's a dwarf because, again, small space, loquat, and multiple citrus varieties. And then, because they're organized into strict tree lines, you can just keep on continuously adding seeds, knowing exactly where they're going to pop up. They're going to be right where they want to be. So that's what those species are going to look like in this more subtropical evergreen area. Again, especially once the shelter begins to establish from the south, the Mexican sunflower, the biomass bananas, the sugarcane, these are going to have no problem establishing and, again, creating that really nice, lush, subtropical jungle feeling around your social space. As we move around to the front, we're going to look at the temperate and Mediterranean combination of plants. Again, context for this particular area, the most exposed ridge, so we're needing some drought-tolerant species, and they need to be deciduous for the winter sun and summer shade. So here we've got Japanese raisin trees, apples, plums, pears, peaches, persimmon, citrus, again, we're combining citrus in both areas, the short dwarf citrus in this front area, larger citrus like oranges and grapefruit out the back. And then we've got tons of berries, huge diversity of berries, because we want that early succession crops. We want those early succession treats and goodies, because we don't just want to be waiting on our fruit trees. That's a huge part of syntropic agroforestry, is getting that early succession of whether it's annuals, perennial vegetables, berries, short-lived perennial trees like cherry, guavas, tamarillos, bananas, and then we get into the long-term stuff like the Japanese raisin trees, peaches, persimmons, that sort of thing. Our berries are going to include blueberry varieties, raspberries, blackberries, boysenberries, wineberries, currants, alpine strawberries, and like I said, around the deck there's going to be grapes and passion fruit. A little bit of context for the social space: basically just needs shelter from the wind, needs good vibes like a lush edible jungle, and privacy from the south end road. So that's all kind of being accomplished by the planting strategies that we're looking at. The perennial vegetables and herbs that we're including: globe artichokes, rhubarb, rosemary, spring onions and chives, elephant garlic, regular garlic, multiple thyme varieties, oregano, sage, tea plants, dill, fennel, spearmint, stevia, all sorts of different things that aren't included on this list. Those are just the ones off the top of my head and that we had space for. So there's also a whole assortment of annual vegetables in here that didn't make the list, but that's part of the big early succession flush of production and creating the initial placenta. Basically, the placenta stage in agroforestry is those fast-producing early succession species. And so in a lot of cases, we've got the annuals. We also put a cover crop of lupins down in certain key areas. The key areas are on those support lines. We put lupins where all the support species are going to go, because right now we're heading into winter. We don't want to plant those more subtropical chop and drop species like the Mexican sunflower, bonnegrass, because those are going to be things that really want to get established like really well before cold comes. We're going to wait on establishing a lot of the subtropical species, whether it's those support species or the edible ones like the bananas, the tamarillos. So a lot of things are going to wait until spring, the papaya included. In the meantime, we're pumping roots in the soil, we're putting nitrogen in the soil because lupins are nitrogen fixing, and then in spring we're going to come through, do a big intervention, chop those down, we have a lot of organic material. During that intervention is when we're going to interplant, plug all those holes in, put the support rows in, do the rest of it. So this was just kind of stage one of this install. It was really exciting. It was cool to see all basically the skeleton, the bones of the system went in, and then as time goes on you can just keep adding more and more in as you kind of wish, and as you know, it's a playful thing. Food forestry is a really playful thing where you get to interact and engage and observe, and you sit back and watch, and then you make decisions, you make interventions. Really, really fun. And then just for this last area where it's subtropical rainwater overflow, we've got kind of the most sheltered space from the house. We've got extra rainwater, so these are going to be perfect for the bananas, figs, and just other water-loving subtropical species to create that really nice jungle environment. We've got the sugarcane, taro, papayas, just things that are going to really create that really nice jungle vibe around the deck. So, and also be super edible. We've gone from pretty much a blank slate to just start to identify some of the different patterns that we might want to use to begin considering how we're planting. You're looking at where your north aspect is, you're looking at where the shelter, access, water, contour, support species, patterns of evergreen deciduous. So hopefully that was really useful. I think we're going to wrap this up here. But again, if you have any questions, you want me to dive into something in another video, happy to do so. But I really hope you got some good value out of this, and I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned something interesting from that video to apply to your own food forest design, property, whatever you're doing. Hope it was interesting, valuable, and see you next time.